Welcome to all of you in our audience. We're so glad that you were able to join us. I am Mara Rudman, the Executive Vice President for Policy at Center for American Progress. America's domestic and international economic policies are inextricably intertwined. Our national economic and national security interests are similarly so. And this pandemic has exposed a lot, including exposing starkly the terrors and frailties in America's economic and societal safety nets and longstanding inequities. Many people are seeing what some have long stated, that we need to build back a middle class where workers have real economic power, and we must tackle the serious national vulnerabilities that result from concentrated and distant supply chains, the consequences of pushing aside efforts to address climate change, and the fast-growing strength of China as a near-peer competitor. For the United States to achieve these ends, we need to find a way forward on trade. And yes, for progressives, this means fighting to boost labor and environmental standards and dialing back special interest extraordinary leverage opportunities. This leaves a lot of space to figure out winning strategies with a wide range of views on how best to do so. I'm very excited by what I know I will learn from the mix of perspectives among our 4 fabulous progressive panelists, and from Representative Jimmy Gomez, who sits on the House Ways and Means Committee, is a member of the House Democratic Working Group on Trade and Assistant Whip, and just a terrific person to have join us and kick us off. So Representative Gomez, so pleased that you're here with us today and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Mara. I really appreciate the invitation to participate on this panel, or at least give the opening remarks. Just to give people context, I got elected in a special election in 2017 to replace Javier Becerra. This was a seat that was unexpected. I was serving in the state assembly, and it was a quick race, and I got elected, and I got appointed to the Natural Resources Committee and Oversight in the minority, right? And if you know anything about being in the minority in the House of Representatives, those 2 committees are not the powerhouses, right? So. And I was, at that time, ranked so low, I was beyond 435 in seniority. So I was really, really low. So if anybody ever expected me to be selected to work on trade and work on the new USMCA, I never would have believed it. It was an issue that I was interested in, but I knew that the dynamics on trade had changed with the election of Donald Trump. I went to a good example. I went to a conversation in my early days of being elected, and I thought it was going to be bipartisan. And as I went into the room, it was mostly Democrats. All the Republicans were gone. They didn't even show up for the discussion on the new NAFTA. Maybe because they're in the majority and had real power, or maybe because their views started changing. And then about a year later, after I got onto the Ways and Means Committee, a year and a half after I got onto the Ways and Means Committee, I went on a trip with some Republicans. And then when the Republicans started parroting the comments of Donald Trump when it came to trade, especially tariffs. I had even one of them say that, tariffs were raising the American taxpayers millions of dollars from the Chinese. So it really did give me like this vision of that their party had shifted on trade, which provided a very unique opportunity. So I was interested on working in the being part of the group that negotiated the new NAFTA or the USMCA. And so when I got the call from Speaker Pelosi to be on it, I think it caught a lot of people by surprise, but it also, she broke it down in 4 sections. She said, we're going to focus on enforcement, labor, environment, and access to medicines. Those are the 4 components. So she appointed 2 members of the Democratic caucus to negotiate on behalf of the entire caucus with Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and Chairman Richard Neal as the chair of that working group. She gave me an option of either doing, she goes, I think you would be good either in environment because of my work in the environmental policy in California, or labor because of my labor background working for AFSCME International, as well as the AFSCME nurses, and being a strong advocate for workers' rights. So I thought I wanted to take the harder assignment. I asked to be selected for the labor working group portion. And that's how it started. But the working group was something that I think was the brainchild of Speaker Pelosi. It was actually very smart because she selected people, and this is why I'm gonna say it's not about my involvement only, but it selected a group of people that represented the different wings of the Democratic caucus. Everything from Rosa DeLauro and Jan Schakowsky to Terry Sewell and Richard Neal, who was more in the middle, who most people forget that Richard Neal actually voted against the original NAFTA, right? Most people forget that. So we were there to negotiate this agreement. And most people, when I told them I accepted the assignment, how do you turn the speaker down? They thought I was crazy because I come from the progressive wing of the caucus. And even a colleague of mine, he said, don't do it. It's a suicide mission in so many words. You're never gonna get it done and you're gonna get labor mad at you. So, but we did seem to have a good working relationship. We understood what we had to get done, and we coalesced as a group. And we were able to, for the first time ever in the history of trade agreements, include an enforcement mechanism that's never been done before in a trade agreement. It was done in an annex, but not in a trade agreement. And it will now have a facility-specific rapid response mechanism to directly enforce violation of key labor obligations. That's never been done. We were trying to find a better acronym. We couldn't find that better acronym, but for that rapid response mechanism. And we also were able to include some of the highest environmental standards of any trade agreement in the history of this country, with new custom verification agreements to enhance enforcement. We also secured 600 million when you add up the money to clean up the Tijuana River plus the NAD Bank money, over 600 million in order to leverage environmental cleanup along the border. That's a big deal. And then we were able to take out the pharmaceutical drug protections. That was a big deal. And we have to understand that this, I believe, sets a high watermark on what a labor agreement can do. You know, we actually got 385 votes to 41. Broad bipartisan support, 89 to 10 in the Senate. And I think it was because we addressed the concerns of the caucus that we represent. And we also have to understand that we did it in a way that we knew where the members were. Most people didn't know that 135 to 138 members had never voted on any trade agreement ever in their careers, ever. So all of a sudden they have this opportunity to vote on a trade agreement. They had concerns. A lot of them had campaigned on controlling pharmaceutical drug pricing. If that remained, we would have lost a chunk of those voters, or as voters, as our colleagues on the deal. So everything we did was to achieve the goals that the caucus and Speaker Pelosi set out. In the end, Speaker Pelosi is the one who ended up negotiating the final product towards the end at the 5-yard line, as Richard Trumka would like to say. We were at the 5-yard line for a while, but it was a feat. But we did it because we stuck to the values of the Democratic caucus. Was it easy? No. Was it contained to the political environment that we found ourselves in, being in the House, a majority in the House, but not in the Senate and not holding the White House? Yes. But did it play a role that President Trump was going to get impeached and that he needed a win? Of course. But most people didn't see it that way at the time. They thought it would derail the negotiations. They thought it would lead to a collapse. But it did not, because we stuck to the values of what we were trying to achieve. But every trade agreement, in my belief, as I've studied them and as I kind of watched and I had conversations with different staffers who are experts, is a product of the times that they're in, right? Who's the president, who's the House, who's the Senate. But it doesn't mean that this is not a new kind of way forward. If we want to go back to barely passing trade agreements by bare majorities, then you revert back to the old, right? And the old is that you only considered how much you're going to grow the GDP of your country without giving real concerns about the environment, workers' rights, women's rights, environmental protections, drug pricing. If we want to go back to barely getting by on trade agreements, then that's what you would go back to the pre-USMCA days. but I don't think that's an option. I think that that will leave an opportunity to have, I believe, the Republicans to stake out a turf of where the American people truly are on trade, which is they believe in economic growth, but they also want to see that these values are also put forward and protected. So it is not an easy thing to do, because you're threading a needle between two ideologies of free trade or very restricted trade. Right? This is something different. When I was in Congress, I worked for Hilda Solis in 2003, 2004. People had these debates all the time. Okay, trade, what's fair trade? You know, nobody could, you know, they always say, oh, I'm not for free trade, but I'm for fair trade. And then you would ask them what that means. They could never define it. This is, I believe, the USMCA is a starting point of what a fair trade and progressive trade agenda would look like. But it's not going to be simple. We negotiated USMCA pre-COVID. COVID has changed a lot of and showed the weaknesses of our supply chain, made people think about, you know, what should we bring back home in manufacturing? How should we strengthen the supply chains of manufacturing of different products that really have a national interest? You know, we never knew, but sometimes you don't know what those national interests are. Who knew that face masks were in the national interest from the general public perspective, right? Maybe the expert perspective in Washington did, but the general voter did not. So we have a lot to do, but I do believe that we have to keep moving forward. Sliding back before the USMCA, you know, to say even a TPP era is not going to cut it. You're not going to get the Democratic votes that we need in the House in order to pass it. Maybe you'll get the 20 that will always vote for any trade agreement, and you can count them on both hands, and then also figure out who the rest of them are. But we need to push forward this agenda. There was an article in the Council on Foreign Relations that asked, is this the new trade consensus? It will be the new trade consensus if we focus on the enforcement of what we actually just achieved. So you all are the experts. You have been working on this issue a lot longer than I have. But my belief is that we need to lean into trade as Democrats and progressives and not let it be defined by our opponents. And with that, I will end my remarks. It might have gone on a little longer than I would like, but we definitely need to, I just want to say one last thing is thank you so much to all of you. I learned a lot about trade and continue to learn from all of you and with your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Representative Gomez, for kicking us off here and helping to further frame what we need to grapple with overall as progressives, and certainly in this conversation today. Really appreciate your joining us, so thank you. I am now going to introduce briefly our panelists here. I say briefly because I know we have limited time, and their backgrounds deserve far more than I am giving here. But I'm going to give you the highlights that are what makes them such compelling contributors for this discussion. We have the Honorable Fred Hochberg, who's the former chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States under President Obama from 2009 to 2017. He also served as deputy and then acting administrator of the Small Business Administration under President Clinton, and he is the author of Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, which is an extremely purposefully accessible read. And I believe you just saw it. And we have Commissioner Rhonda Schmidtlein, who is a sitting Democrat on the ITC, which is, of course, an independent trade agency that deals with issues of tariffs, unfair competition, and economic impacts related to trade. And the commissioner was also, in a former capacity, chief negotiator on behalf of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, also known as PCAOB, where she focused particularly on and has extensive background on issues related to Chinese companies. And she previously, before that, served in the Office of the General Counsel for the U.S. Trade Representative. So welcome, Commissioner Schmidt-Line. We also have Dr. Bill Spriggs, who is the AFL-CIO's chief economist, esteemed economics professor at Howard University, and Dr. Spriggs chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as having served as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the Department of Labor in the first term of President Obama's first term. And last but absolutely not least, we have Ms. Catherine Tai, who is the lead advisor to the chairman and Democratic members of the Ways and Means Committee on Matters of International Trade, and also served in a prior capacity as counsel for China Trade Enforcement with responsibility for development and litigation of U.S. disputes against China at the WTO. So I'm sure you can see why I'm so excited by this group that we have. I'm going to turn to Chairman Hochberg, to Fred first. And Fred is joining us. Fred went the extra several miles here and losing electricity at his home and finding an alternative location to join us from. So we particularly appreciate that extra effort, Fred. Your book, as I said, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, is an intentionally easy read so that it is fully accessible to a wide audience who are not trade specialists. I would count myself in that category. And it makes the case for expanding trade. At the same time, you acknowledge that some workers and communities can take real hits and that existing programs maybe are not adequate in providing help. I'm curious, in terms of this range of challenges, how would you approach, what would you suggest are the top three things the United States should be doing to most effectively move forward with an expansive trade vision? And I don't know how much you feel what Representative Gomez laid out to us, contains some of those elements, but interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm speaking from, I found a bench behind a Whole Foods parking lot, which is the one place I was able to get internet service right now, because a lot of trees are down up where I am in Connecticut. Well, first of all, we don't need a trade agreement to have trade. We don't have a trade agreement with Vietnam. We trade with them. We trade with many countries without trade agreements. So that is not, well, number one, that's not a criteria. Sorry, I got a truck coming by. That's a little noisy. So that would be number one. Number two, where I think we really, and I'll use the word failed as a country, is we never really provided an adequate safety net for workers whose lives were upended, terribly upended by trade. And certainly NAFTA made that very painful, and particularly in a lot of Midwestern states, which, by the way, coincidentally or not, also are battleground states, which I think has kept trade in the front issue, center stage for the last 25 plus years. So I think the COVID crisis, which it relates to this, has really shown that we have a very weak social safety net. We have a weak unemployment system. We have a weak worker training system, and those things need to be remedied, not just for trade, but frankly, with the coming automation, with the coming AI, we're not really prepared. We should be preparing workers in advance, not when they've had a setback. So one, we don't need to have a trade agreement. Number two, we ought to be thinking about how we're really preparing American workers to face what is coming towards us. And frankly, the COVID crisis has, I think, collapsed timeframes. Things that were taking maybe 5 years are going to be happening in 12 to 18 months in terms of some of the online, some of the displacement of workers. And if we're going to talk about displacement of workers, we are displacing millions of retail workers, and many of them are women and people of color. And we have not heard a lot of talk about how we're really addressing them. So one is how we address people. Two, we can have trade. We don't need to have a trade agreement to trade with people. And three, I think at some level, USMCA puts down some markers, but I think there are unique circumstances, and I'm not sure we should assume that we can replicate that over and over again. And I'm going to go on mute until you call on me again.
Thanks, Fred. Dr. Spriggs, Bill, if I might, you are a labor economist. You devote significant attention to considering what jobs and types of jobs should be available at what wages. I know you've reflected a lot on trade's impact on labor markets and worker power. How would you react to what Fred has laid out, and how would you describe the impact on American working families, not just in the immediate time that we're in, but really since China joined the WTO in the 2000s or an earlier period, if that's where you would start from?
Well, let me segue from Fred's initial observation that we know in theory that there will be impact on workers, and yet we never take seriously of what those impacts would be or on the communities in which they live. And there has been too much effort on the part of economists to erase the thought that workers are impacted. And that further makes the whole conversation difficult. Constantly economists who are not looking at jobs, but looking at the share of jobs in manufacturing, argue that, oh, well, American workers are silly because look, they've lost so many jobs to technology. And you'd be hard pressed to find an American worker who saw somebody bring a robot in and replace them. The bulk of workers who are working with increased technology know that the way most of that gets absorbed is companies stop hiring. It's not that they lost a job. Other people didn't get a job, but it's not that they lost a job. And so what infuriates workers is that beginning in 2001, we actually lost jobs. We started 2001 with about 17 million manufacturing workers. We're down to close to 13 million manufacturing workers. In that interim, we started with 8 million workers in restaurants and bars. We now have about 13 million workers in restaurants and bars. So, the idea that, oh, we'll lose 5 million manufacturing jobs and they'll all end up being computer programmers. We lost 5 million manufacturing jobs. They all ended up in restaurants. So we have to deal with the reality of the market. I would say the deeper threat from trade agreements, though, is cementing a view about the work relationship and cementing a view about government's relation to corporations. That makes it harder to regulate the labor market domestically. It creates a view that what businesses need is defined by competition that they themselves have created by creating trade agreements that don't allow for worker safety and worker decent pay and safety nets. And we're all reaping the whirlwind of that now, because those countries that, we celebrated, oh, look, we have their workers out of poverty. They're now making $2 a day. And we've gotten them from, poverty when they made less than $1 a day. We didn't build in the kind of needs that those governments faced for establishing social safety nets for their exposure to global trade. And now we see that those nations are suffering greatly. And we face a global threat of famine because there are large sets of people in countries where their governments are being brought to the kneeling position because of the COVID and the lack of resiliency within their nations. And then on our end, as Fred laid out, we don't develop the safety nets for our own workers. And so we have let our safety net deteriorate in the face of this broader philosophy about what businesses need, and taken away what we need for protecting our environment and protecting our workers. And because of that, it's almost impossible now to see how we could execute the Paris Accords on the environment, because unless you build into trade agreements the ability to talk about the Paris Accords, then you're going to have American workers forever angry at the idea that, oh, so you can export pollution, benefit from it, and then those countries that are serious about the Paris Accords are left at a huge advantage. There is no way that we can move forward addressing what we now know are global vulnerabilities to pandemics. And we know there is a global threat to our environment. These must be paramount. Business interests have to take 5 steps back. And we need trade agreements that put governments first, the ability of governments to raise revenue first, and then business needs need to be part of this broader stakeholder community. And that broader stakeholder community includes workers, retirees, children, and our environment.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Comprehensive view of the landscape there and very helpful. I want to focus in on one of the stakeholder elements that you just referenced, Bill, and ask Commissioner Schmidtlein, Rhonda. You certainly have a special vantage point on domestic business impacts. And curious about, in terms of your time at the ITC, you've evaluated regularly whether industries are suffering from material injury, from unfair trade, and a variety of aspects. What are the top lessons you draw from your time at the ITC and previous to that as well, but in terms of the domestic business impact and how we ought to approach these issues from that angle?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today, but first let me just give the standard disclaimer, since I am a sitting commissioner at the ITC, that I am appearing here today in my personal capacity, and that I do not speak for the ITC or my fellow commissioners or the ITC staff. So just want to make sure that's clear. Well, so as you probably know, over the past, since I've been at the ITC, which has been a little over 6 years, we have seen an explosion of cases in terms of AD/CVD cases. Our caseload has probably at least doubled and maybe even tripled. Just in the last month, we had 7 new cases filed within 2 weeks, 7 new investigations. And usually the ITC budgets for something like 24 investigations in the entire year, new investigations, not counting sunset reviews. So we're just seeing an explosion of those cases. So I have seen a lot of industries through my work on those cases, in addition to the 332 reports that we do and even the 337 cases that we handle. And I would offer that I've observed, because I know there is a lot of debate around the use of tariffs and strong opinions on all sides, but from where I sit, I have seen AD/CVD duties and tariffs that have been applied as a part of safeguard relief make a difference for workers, and in some cases actually increase competition. So I know there's a concern about tariffs being protectionist and actually eliminating competition, but if you look, for example, at the 2 safeguards that we had in the last few years, one on washing machines and one on solar, including solar cells and solar module manufacturers, you would see that after those safeguards went into place, there were a number of new producers that started domestic manufacturing and invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the United States and produced, that accounts for thousands of jobs, actually. I mean, just in the washers case alone, it was over 1,000 jobs. And I think when you look at and I'm talking about module manufacturers here, and it's an interesting contrast because the cell producers, the solar cell producers, did not get the degree of relief under that safeguard that module manufacturers did. And you did not see cell production increase in the United States or come back, but we have seen major investments in domestic manufacturing of modules. So I think in the right circumstance, I'm not saying that it works in every industry, Obviously, it's going to depend on the conditions of competition in that industry, the business environment overall. But I don't think they should be dismissed out of hand as just protectionist. I think they are a tool that can be effective for workers and for competition.
Thank you. That's it's really interesting, Rhonda, and appreciate that angle. Ms. Ty, Catherine, let me turn to you now, and I'm going to ask you to focus particularly on China-related issues, given your experience and vantage point at Ways and Means in the House, as well as at USTR, handling China trade enforcement. How would you characterize how the United States has approached economic and security competition with China, given the very strong competitor that I would say that China is at this point? And then would you have any kind of specific commentary on the current administration's approach in that respect as well? And how should we be thinking about this going forward? Appreciate it's a big and challenging topic, but really like to get your perspective.
Thank you so much, Mara, and thanks to CAP for having me and allowing me to participate alongside these really wonderful colleagues. I also want to preface my remarks to say that unusually for me today, I'm not speaking for my boss, Chairman Neal, or Subcommittee Chairman Blumenauer, but I am really glad to have this opportunity to share thoughts and observations that I have gathered from the incredible privilege of working with our members on committee and in the caucus. So on your question on China, let me just start with also saying that I so appreciate that we are having this conversation, and that to me, this is an important indication that we are on a good path, because we are talking about what a progressive vision for trade is. I think with respect to China as a part of our trade landscape, what I would say about the dynamics on U.S.-China competition, which has both economic elements and also strategic elements, which make it very challenging, but also incredibly important, is that the lessons that we have had over these most recent years in trying to formulate, articulate, and advance a progressive trade agenda should also be taken into consideration in the approach to China. And I think one of the most important lessons is to have robust political support, and that is within the Congress and also with the American people in terms of what you're going to do on trade. With the China issues, one of the really special aspects of the U.S.-China trade dynamic is that traditionally you have really broad, robust, bipartisan support on the issue of China and U.S.-China competition. What I would say is, we need to apply the same progressive principles to the U.S.-China competitive aspect, which is to think hard about where the political support is in terms of rising up to all of the different China challenges, and also to be inclusive, which I think is a key part of progressive trade policy in our strategy. And I think that also gets at the most critical part is we have to be really smart about what we are going to do here. So, on the China issue, I think that it's not for fractured political support for taking steps. I think that there will be really robust, and we are seeing it, really robust political support for taking aggressive and bold steps with respect to how we compete with China. But what we need to do, and this will be my sort of oblique commentary on this administration's approach, is we have to be really strategic about it. We have to think about the fact that, yes, we are facing very stiff competition from China, but China is not going away. And so I think that critically, a good and progressive trade policy has to have both offensive and defensive elements. And on this, I would say that in terms of what we've experienced over these most recent years with this administration, they have been very strong on confronting China very aggressively. But I would characterize those measures as actually largely defensive. And again, you must have both defensive and offensive. But with respect to counteracting unfair trade practices, enforcing our trade rights, I see those primarily as defensive maneuvers. That is to make sure that China is playing by the rules, or if not playing by the rules, that we are taking countermeasures. I think the offense has got to be about what we are going to do to make ourselves and our workers and our industries and our allies faster, nimbler, be able to jump higher, be able to compete stronger, and ultimately be able to defend this open, democratic way of life that we have. It is about more than just economics and economic values. It is also about our political and our broader values. But there is a lot at stake, and I think that there is a lot of opportunity. There is clearly also a very, very great challenge.
Thank you. Let me ask whether Bill, Rhonda, Fred, do you want to follow up on what Catherine has laid out in that framing before we go on to other questions?
Well, I'll jump in for a second. You know, partly I think I agree with Catherine in that here's an analogy. You know, you're in school, you're in the 5th grade, and you're one of the best kids in the class, and a new kid moves to town, and he seems or she seems smarter and more adept. You can do one of two things. You can decide to study harder to make sure you stay the #1 in the class, or you can try and trip them up. And we're playing the role of trying to trip up China versus getting better ourselves, investing in more industry here, investing in infrastructure, making this a better place for workers and businesses to thrive in, and frankly, addressing issues like social justice and inequality, which actually hampers us to being a global power. So I think, at least that's how I understood Catherine's role. Part of we need to be much more offensive in doing that, and not just trying to say China's bad. We're not as bad as they are, so you should like us. And I think that's a bit of our policy right now.
Rhonda?
Hi. Well, I think I'll just add that I agree with Fred and Catherine. That would be one of the things I would suggest that we focus on, trying to diversify our supply chains, onshore some critical industries, and keep them onshored by, removing the incentives in these trade agreements that allow a race to the bottom, and then incentivize, offshore production. So I think all of that package could be what you, I guess, would call an offensive approach to it. I would say the other maybe risk, I guess you would call it, given that there is bipartisan support, everyone is focused on this, is that we settle for something less than a substantive resolution. In other words, that we declare victory and move on if we get some sort of minor changes. This was, you mentioned that, I spent over 8 years at this little known agency called the PCAOB, who's still there, that regulates public company audit firms, and it includes foreign audit firms. And so I went there from USTR, from having been a USTR negotiator, because they needed someone to negotiate access to these foreign auditors, for us to regulate them. And so at the time, we had many meetings with China. China refused to cooperate. And when I left the PCAOB at the end of 2011, we had reached agreement with 36 other countries. We were doing joint inspections in those countries, and China was still refusing to cooperate. And that was at a time when it was, I would say, still fashionable for people to assume that China would eventually play by the rules that everybody else was playing by. But we did not, and the board did not, succumb to that pressure to just enter into a superficial agreement and declare victory and move on. And now you see, you know, there's been legislation introduced in the Senate that would block access for those Chinese companies if they continue to refuse PCOB inspections. So it has taken a while, but I think we are finally now coming around to, at least for the PCOB, to be able to really enforce its rules, which we hope will elicit compliance. So I hope we just don't declare victory and move on now that we have everyone looking at this issue.
I don't know that I would agree with Fred's characterization that China was the smarter kid and is outworking us. I think the difference is that we handed over to our corporations their own self-interest and let them act in their own self-interest. Those manufacturers who are based in the U.S. and committed to making things in the U.S. were not at the table. And so we wrote a set of rules that are great if you're a multinational corporation. And so I don't think that they're outsmarting us, outworking us. I think they are playing by a set of rules meant to benefit a different set of people. And we have relegated that authority and that to our multinational corporations. They were the only ones allowed to sit at the table. So it's not surprising. I mean, if you're going to negotiate trade agreements and you're going to exclude workers and you're going to exclude environmentalists and you're going to put us on the kiddies table way outside the room, and if you're going to conduct these agreements in secret, so secret that most Congressional Hill staffers have never seen the entire agreements. So, I mean, this is more a secret than our nuclear secrets. There are Hill staffers who can tell you everything about America's national security. I don't think you can find a Hill staffer who knows everything that's in one of our trade agreements because they haven't been allowed to see it and study it. The only people who know that are the American corporations that were sitting at the table doing the deal. So we shouldn't be surprised if American labor had been sitting at the table, we didn't have corporations sitting at the table, it would have been a different deal because of who was at the table. I do agree with Fred, however, that we are doing all the wrong things on the other side, which is the unbelievable nature of what's going on. You see so many people saying, well, we can't afford free college. And then you see another set of people say, you know, it's wonderful. All these countries are sending these students to our American colleges, and our American colleges need these people because we need skilled workers. And you go, wait, Americans can't get free college, but everybody is so happy that other nations are willing to pay for their students to go to American universities. America's not willing to pay for American students to go to American universities. We're just happy that other people are willing to pay to go to American universities. I find this incredible. This unbelievable disconnect between our policy towards skill development of our own people at our own universities versus, oh, let's let somebody else pay for skilled workers and we'll just, you know, let them immigrate here. I mean, I don't get how you can have such a silly discussion, but that's the discussion that we have, that we are so adamant that Americans cannot benefit, that we can't have a focus on American corporations. We can't have a focus on why is it that domestic-based American corporations face these disadvantages? Why do we continue with these ideas of letting corporations decide, actually we're Irish because that's where our intellectual property is, and that's where all our profits are, and so we don't have to pay American taxes. This is beyond absurd. When United Artists was started around 1918, because the movie actors quickly understood the way that the industry was ripping them off, if Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and the rest of them had said, well, you know, these are movies and they're ethereal, right? There's just a film. It's the intellectual property. We're copyrighted in the Channel Islands because, you know, Chaplin was a British citizen. That's where we will pay our taxes. I mean, it would have been absurd. Nobody in 1918 would have accepted that view. I mean, we weren't that stupid in 1918. Suddenly, you know, a century later, we're stupid enough to say, oh, yes, Apple Computer, you really are in Ireland. Honestly, we fall for this stuff. And so I don't think it's that other people are outsmarting us. I think that we have outsmarted ourselves by letting other people profit from us.
Thank you, Bill. I actually want to follow up on that point. Again, I mean, this is a question that I welcome all of you to respond to. China, in a variety of ways, has had a strategic approach as a government. Has had a strategic approach to domestic production and to global supply chains. And we are, as a country, I believe, now rethinking assumptions about our supply chains, the particular issues and challenges with PPE and pharmaceuticals, and even lithium, I have to say, which so much of our technology depends upon. That we, as a country, the United States, are behind the 8 ball in terms of figuring out what we do and how we do it. But I would think that also presents opportunities for us on the offensive side, as Catherine was describing. Rhonda and Fred, you both made reference to supply chains and build to the number of things we can and should be doing here in the United States. So I would like your views on what is the smartest approach for the United States now in dealing with the supply chain concerns we have and looking at that as an opportunity for domestic manufacturing. Do we need a domestic industrial policy? Have we been lacking that? For example, what's the best way to frame how we go forward on these issues?
Well, I'll just be very quick. You know, the idea of reshoring or bringing all this manufacturing back here sounds politically very good. I'm not sure it's as sensible as it sounds on the surface. Certain things, you know, there's discussion about ventilators, for example. Well, we don't know that the next health crisis will require ventilators. And when it comes to things like masks and gowns, it's going to be hard for us to be competitive in that. We might be better off making sure we have really resilient supply chains that are not just inexpensive, which has been often the rule, but you know, when you look at innovation, you look at cost, but you have to look at resiliency. You can't get all of your masks or gowns from one country or one company. That would be far too risky. None of us would take the chance. You know, if our car breaks down, you're going to have to find other ways to get to work. If a supply chain gets interrupted, we need to think through what those are. We probably need to have some of that here. We also need different stockpiling, but it makes me a little anxious that those who would like to bring all manufacturing back to America will use this crisis to further that end and that goal.
Catherine, were you looking to jump in there?
I just wanted to say, you know, we've obviously been in the thick of the supply chain revisitation and thinking really hard about it, along with everybody else, I think, for the past several months. And I just want to say, I think that the idea of the policymaker who wants to bring everything home is a bit of a straw man. And I just want to say, from my vantage point of being in contact with a lot of our members in the House, there's not a single one that I have encountered on, you know, either end of the spectrum or anywhere in between who is saying, let's bring everything home. I think it is very instinctive for them that to the extent that what we're experiencing right now is vulnerability from concentrated sourcing, unregulated, overcomplicated supply chains, that bringing everything home creates the same kind of vulnerability. I think, Fred, you know, the other thing that you said, which is something that we have been thinking a lot about with our members and talking a lot about, also is that, you know, resilience requires us also to be trading. Resilience also requires us to be versatile and to be able to pivot. You're right. You know, whether it's masks or ventilators, those ended up being the key things that we didn't have enough of this time around. We know there will be another national emergency. We don't necessarily know the contours of it, but in our consultations with our friends in labor, our friends in the manufacturing community, our friends who rely on globalized supply chains, one of the things that's become very clear and very powerful to me is that it is critical for any nation. It is critical for us because I think we've lost quite a bit of this to have a critical mass, if you will, of ongoing manufacturing activity to maintain the versatility and also the innovation ecosystem that we need to be able to pivot and to be able to respond. And Mara, to your question about whether or not this is something we call a domestic industrial policy, I know that, you know, there are friends of ours who are very comfortable with that terminology, and there are friends in this greater family that we live in who are very allergic to that particular terminology. I don't know what we call it. Do we just call it an industrial strategy? Do we just call it strategic thinking? Whatever it is, yes, absolutely. I think we need to be thinking ahead. You know, the future is everything that lies ahead of us, and you know, we need to make sure that our policies, our broader economic policies, our social policies, our safety net policies, all of these things are not only working in concert, but that they are working towards making sure that the beneficiaries are the American people in all of the different ways that we mean the American people.
Thanks very much, Rhonda. Let me just say, I'm only stopping you guys because we had a whole flood of questions that came in the last few minutes, and so I want to try to get to at least one or two of them. So apologies for cutting off Rhonda and Bill there. But a question that I believe came from Michael Stumo in the audience: do multilateral, not bilateral trade deficits matter? Does the share of the domestic U.S. market supplied by U.S. businesses and workers matter? Should trade strategy aim to increase net exports and domestic market share for U.S. businesses and workers? Who wants to tackle some or all of those?
Obviously, more exports are better. They create a lot of jobs. Thankfully, I was able to work with President Obama running the Export-Import Bank, and our export strategy was purely driven by jobs, not by profits or who own the company, but how many workers are employed and jobs. And quickly on multilateral trade deficits, no, I wouldn't get all hung up on that either. I don't think bilateral make a big difference, and multilateral don't make that large a difference either. We need a smart economic policy.
I think Rhonda, Bill, did you want to join in there?
I mean, we have to deal with the reality that there are huge trade imbalances in the world. Most countries are closer to having balanced trade. There are a few countries that run surpluses for as long as the eye can see. The United States and the UK stand out as running trade deficits for as long as the eye can see. It's not sustainable. For everybody who wants to say, oh, we worry so much about fiscal deficits and this is so horrible and how can you have them forever? A fiscal deficit is as big a drain as the trade deficit if you run it forever. And so, you know, there are too many people who ignore that it's not sustainable that you run infinite trade deficits, because then you wake up one morning and you got to pay the piper. You wake up one morning, you find out that you're a colony because you don't own anything. So, so we have to worry about these things. If you worry about autonomy, if you worry about who has to be paid, and you do have to worry about how this plays out globally as well. And the trade practices of China and the trade regime that we have created generally in the world have created a less stable world, because the countries that are now part of the global supply chain simply lack resiliency. We're not paying their workers enough money. We're not paying enough taxes to those governments. and they just lack resiliency. This is not good for anyone.
Thanks, Ron.
Mara, okay. Well, what I was going to say is I feel like whether trade deficits matter sort of depends on which economist you ask. I'm not an economist, but I would say that the question seems to really go to, you know, should we be worried about the concentration of our supply chains? And to Catherine's point, you know, do we have a strategy? Do we have a domestic strategy, whether you want to call that a domestic industrial policy or what have you, to have critical supply chains onshored, right? So not every manufacturer, not every industry, but I think there could be a strategy where you look at what we should be manufacturing in the United States so that we do have resiliency and can deal with the next crisis. And then I just want to make the point again, I think you can do that, but you still have to come back to what are the incentives in the current trade agreements that are in force. And right now, those incentives do incentivize offshore production. So I think it has to be a package. You can't leave out that piece because you're not going to be able to keep those companies onshore if you don't change those incentives, you know, by including enforceable labor standards, enforceable environmental standards, you know, dealing with currency manipulation, those types of things.
Thanks very much. I know we are at time, but I'm hoping, unless we're cut off, that we can squeeze in one last question here. And with apologies that we've got some great questions that have come in just at the very end. This question from Beth Baltzon is directed to Fred, but also welcome others to the extent we can squeeze this in. And the question is, we do not have a bilateral agreement with Vietnam, but we do have a trade agreement with Vietnam through the WTO. The WTO doesn't have labor or environmental rules. Would you suggest reforming the WTO so that it does, or does the United States only have to build a better social safety net and not reform trade rules themselves?
And I should do that in 30 seconds. There's, you know, the WTO is right now sort of in center stage in terms of requiring some reform. Both Democrats and Republicans have been opposed to it for different reasons, and partly what was just mentioned in terms of environmental and labor standards. WTO is going forward with a new Director General. He or she will have a huge task ahead of themselves. That is obviously one way. You know, as I mentioned, all I was trying to make the point is we can trade with countries without a trade agreement. We only should have a trade agreement if for some reason the trade is not working well enough in whether it's on labor, environment, or rule of law, or unfair regulations. Then you need to have you come up with a trade agreement to try and remedy that. I was just trying to make the point. When trade agreements are so difficult in our environment, we can also work with countries without actually having a formal agreement.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that, or should we leave that as the last? Catherine, please. Yes.
I'll try to be very brief. I think in terms of coming up with a more strategic and comprehensive approach to our trade economic policies, there is a debate around, and I think Beth's question gets at this, around do we just need better policies for our trade policies to coordinate with, or do we need to have better trade policies also? And I think that we need both. I think that we need all of the pieces around trade to make sure they're all working together, and you don't just have trade policies doing one thing here and then nothing happening on the other side. That said, I think that a progressive trade policy is one that is ambitious about learning from the past decades of what has happened and crafting better policies and learning from what we've experienced.
But I would just throw in, I agree with Fred, because these are really investment agreements. They aren't trade agreements. So we can trade without having trade agreements, and we can definitely trade without having investment agreements.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this response, and very much to all of you for participating with us. I said at the beginning I was going to learn a lot. I have, and I hope those in the who have been listening feel that as well. And thank you to everyone who's listening for the terrific questions that we received as well. And again, big thanks to all of our panelists. Clearly, hard to think of a more important topic for discussion and ways forward. And thank you very much for being here and sharing with us on this.
Thank you.